Gang members rob an elderly black veteran, not knowing he once led Delta Force. The garage door groaned open at exactly 6:15 in the morning, the same time it had opened every day for the past 11 years. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, tank top clinging to shoulders that still carried the shape of a man who had once carried more than most people could imagine. His arms were a map of faded ink, old tattoos from a life he rarely spoke about, scars underneath them that told stories no ink could capture. At 61 years old, he moved with the quiet economy of someone who had learned, decades ago, that wasted motion could cost a life. He was wiping down the hood of a 1968 Shelby Mustang, silver with black racing stripes, the only thing in this world he had ever truly loved, besides his late wife and the daughter she left behind. The car wasn't for sale. It had never been for sale. People offered him money for it constantly, absurd amounts, because word had gotten around the neighborhood that the quiet old man in the garage on 5th and Larkin owned something rare. He always said the same thing, not for sale, never explained why, never had to. 3 young men were already standing at the mouth of the garage before he even turned around. He heard them before he saw them, the particular rhythm of sneakers on concrete that wasn't casual, wasn't a stroll, was a formation, even if they didn't know they were walking in one. Marcus had spent 31 years learning to read footsteps, breathing patterns, the micro-shifts in a group's body language that separated a customer from a threat. He didn't need to turn around to know these 3 weren't here to ask about an oil change. He turned around anyway, calm, unbothered. That was part of what made people underestimate him, and he had long ago stopped minding. The one in front had tattoos crawling up his neck, a chain thick enough to double as a tow cable, hands stuffed in his pockets in a way that screamed he was gripping something. Behind him, a second man carried a duffel bag slung across his shoulder, unzipped just enough to reveal stacks of cash pressed together like bricks. The third, younger, barely 20 by the look of him, hung back near the entrance, eyes darting toward the street like he was watching for someone who might interrupt whatever this was. "Old man," the one in front said, voice flat, rehearsed. "This your ride?" Marcus set down his rag slowly, folding it once before placing it on the workbench beside him. "Been mine since 1974, he said. "Bought it with my first Army paycheck." The young man smirked, glancing back at his companions, like the answer confirmed something for him. "Army paycheck? That's cute. Well, today it's going to be my ride, and you're going to hand me the keys, real slow, and nobody's got to get hurt." Marcus studied him, not with fear, with something closer to sadness, the way a man looks at a storm he's already survived 100 times before, one that doesn't scare him anymore, only tires him. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly known, was that the tired old mechanic standing in front of them had once commanded operations where the margin between life and death was measured in fractions of a second. They saw an old black man in a stained tank top, someone who fixed cars for a living in a forgotten corner of the city, someone the world had trained them to see as small. They had no idea they were standing 3 feet away from a man who had once led one of the most elite units in American military history, a man whose name, 20 years ago, could clear a room of generals into silence. But that story hadn't started this morning. It had started decades earlier, in a house 2 miles from where he now stood, in a life that had shaped every quiet, deliberate movement he made. Marcus Webb was born in 1963 to a mother who cleaned office buildings at night and a father who drove a delivery truck by day, coming home, smelling of diesel and exhaustion, but never once raising his voice at his son. They lived in a 2-bedroom rental with peeling paint and a roof that leaked whenever it rained hard enough, but his mother kept the floors so clean you could have eaten off them, and his father taught him, before Marcus was even 10 years old, that a man's word was the only currency that never lost its value. The neighborhood wasn't kind to boys like Marcus. He watched friends disappear into gangs, into prison, into early graves, one after another. a slow bleeding of potential the world outside never seemed to notice or care about. Marcus was smart, disciplined, quiet in a way that made teachers nervous because they couldn't tell if he was planning something or simply thinking. He was neither. He was surviving, and he was watching everything, cataloguing it, the way he would later catalogue terrain and threat patterns halfway across the world. At 18, with no money for college and a draft board that had already found his name, Marcus enlisted. He didn't do it out of patriotism exactly, not the kind people talk about in movies. He did it because it was a door, one of the only doors open to a young black man from his part of the city that didn't lead directly toward prison or an early funeral. He walked through it and never looked back. The army noticed him quickly, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he was precise. He could read a map faster than officers twice his rank. He could hold still for hours without complaint. He absorbed instruction like dry ground absorbs rain, and by the time he was 23, instructors were already quietly flagging his file for selection boards most soldiers never even heard about. He was selected for Delta Force in 1989, one of a handful of black soldiers in his cohort, and he never spoke about what that selection process cost him, physically or otherwise. What he would say, decades later, only to the people he trusted most, was that the hardest part wasn't the training. It was walking into rooms where men assumed, based on nothing but the color of his skin, that he had gotten there through some quota, some mistake, some accident. He proved them wrong not with words, but with performance, mission after mission, until the men who had once doubted him would have followed him into fire without hesitation. And they did, repeatedly, across deserts, across mountains, across cities whose names never made the evening news because the operations conducted there were never meant to. Marcus Webb rose through the ranks of an organization that officially, according to most of the American public, didn't fully exist. He led teams into situations where failure meant body bags, where the decisions he made in seconds determined whether young men with families back home would ever see them again. He carried that weight for over 2 decades, and when he finally retired at 50, he carried it home with him too, quiet and heavy, the way soldiers do. He opened the garage not because he needed the money, though the money helped, but because his hands needed something to do that wasn't destruction. Fixing engines was the opposite of everything he had spent his career doing. It was rebuilding instead of dismantling, restoration instead of extraction. The Shelby Mustang had been his first purchase after his first deployment pay, bought at 19 years old with money he'd saved obsessively, and it had traveled with him, in storage, across every base and every relocation for over 40 years. It wasn't a car, it was the last unbroken thread connecting the boy he had been to the man he had become. So when the young man in front of him demanded the keys, Marcus wasn't afraid. He was disappointed in the particular way a man is disappointed when he recognizes a mistake he has seen made 1,000 times before, one that never stops breaking his heart, no matter how many times he witnesses it. "Son," Marcus said, voice even, "you don't want to do this." The young man laughed, short and humorless, glancing back at his crew for validation. "Old man's giving me advice now. That's rich." He took a step closer, and Marcus noted, without moving his eyes, the outline of a weapon pressed against the fabric of his hoodie pocket. Not drawn, not yet, but present, and the young man wanted him to know it was there. What none of the 3 men understood, what they could never have understood standing in that garage, was that Marcus Webb had faced weapons far more sophisticated than whatever was tucked into that boy's pocket, aimed by men far more trained, in conditions far more desperate than a quiet street on a Tuesday morning. Fear for Marcus had been recalibrated so many years ago that what remained wasn't fearlessness exactly. It was something closer to clarity. In moments like this, his mind didn't race. It slowed down methodically, the way it had been trained to for 31 years. "I've got 61 years on this earth," Marcus said quietly, "and I've buried more friends than I can count. You're what, 22? 23? You've got decades ahead of you that you're about to trade for a car that isn't even worth what you think it is." "Don't need a lecture," the young man snapped. And this time he did pull the weapon free, holding it low but visible. A clear escalation meant to end the conversation. Behind him, the man with the duffel bag shifted his weight nervously, glancing toward the street, and the youngest of the three, still hovering near the entrance, looked like he might be sick. This was the moment, the point of rupture, the second where everything that came before collided with everything that was about to happen. Marcus had spent his entire adult life in exactly this kind of moment, situations where the outcome depended entirely on the next 3 seconds of decision-making, and something inside him, some old machinery he thought had gone quiet years ago, clicked back into place with unsettling ease. He raised both hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of surrender that was, in truth, nothing of the sort. It was positioning. "All right," he said. "All right. Keys are on the bench behind me. I'll get them." He turned, unhurried, reaching for a small metal box on the workbench that did, in fact, contain the keys to the Shelby, but his hand paused on the lid for exactly 1 second too long, and in that second, 31 years of instinct and training reasserted themselves completely. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, though to the 3 young men standing in that garage, it would feel, in the retelling for years afterward, like it happened in slow motion, like something out of a film none of them could quite believe they had lived through. Marcus didn't reach for a weapon because he didn't need one. He closed the distance to the young man holding the gun with a speed that seemed physically impossible for a man his age, redirecting the barrel with one hand in a motion so practiced it looked almost gentle, while his other hand and the shift of his hips did the rest. The gun clattered to the concrete floor. The young man was on his back before he understood what had happened. Marcus's knee planted precisely between his shoulder blades, not crushing, not cruel, just immovable, the way a mountain is immovable. The man with the duffel bag froze entirely, the bag slipping from his shoulder, cash spilling loosely across the garage floor, in a scene that would have been almost comical if the tension in the air hadn't been so absolute. The youngest of the 3 simply ran, sprinting out into the street, disappearing around the corner within seconds, leaving his companions behind without a second thought. "Don't move," Marcus said, and his voice had changed entirely. Gone was the tired, patient tone of the mechanic. In its place was something colder, sharper, a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had given orders to elite soldiers under fire and had them followed without question. The man with the duffel bag, still frozen by the spilled cash, felt something in that voice that made his knees weaken involuntarily. Neighbors had begun stepping out onto porches, drawn by the commotion, phones already raised, recording. Mrs. Alvarez, from 2 doors down, who had known Marcus for nearly a decade and always assumed he was simply a kind, quiet man who fixed her son's car for free whenever times were tight, stood on her porch with her mouth open, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with the man she thought she knew. Police arrived within 11 minutes, responding to 3 separate calls. By the time they walked into the garage, Marcus had already zip-tied the young man's wrists with a cable tie he kept in his toolbox for exactly this kind of unlikely necessity, an old habit from a life where you always kept restraints within reach. And the man with the duffel bag was sitting against the wall, hands raised, cash still scattered across the floor around him like confetti from a party nobody wanted. The responding officers, 2 of them, young themselves, barely older than the men they were arresting, looked at the scene with visible confusion. An elderly man standing calmly over 2 restrained young men one of them clearly having been the one holding the weapon now lying harmlessly on the concrete. "Sir, can you tell us what happened here?" one of the officers asked, his tone carrying the same subtle skepticism Marcus had encountered his entire life, the assumption baked into the question that perhaps the old black man standing in the garage wasn't quite as innocent as the scene suggested. Marcus answered calmly, methodically, the way he had once given briefings to commanding officers who outranked him but had learned over time to listen when he spoke. He recounted the attempted robbery in precise, unembellished detail, and as he spoke, something in his bearing, the stillness of his hands, the exact cadence of his voice, made both officers pause and look at him more carefully. "You said you were in the military," the second officer said, glancing at the faded tattoos on Marcus's forearms. 31 years, Marcus said simply. "Retired as a command sergeant major." It wasn't the full truth. Not the part that mattered most. The part he had signed documents decades ago, promising never to speak of casually to strangers. But it was enough of the truth to make the officers exchange a glance, enough to shift something in the way they were now looking at the man in front of them. The story might have ended there, a quiet footnote in a local police blotter, if not for what happened over the following 72 hours. Word of the attempted robbery spread through the neighborhood first, the way stories always do, mouth to mouth, exaggerated slightly with each retelling, until by the second day people were saying the old mechanic had disarmed 3 armed men single-handedly, which was close enough to true that Marcus didn't bother correcting it. A local reporter working a slow news week heard the story from a source at the precinct and drove out to the garage to ask Marcus for an interview. Marcus initially refused. He had spent decades avoiding attention, deliberately, methodically, the way soldiers from certain units are trained to, but the reporter was persistent, and more importantly, she had done her homework. She had submitted a records request and found something Marcus had never discussed publicly in his 11 years running that garage. "Mr. Webb," she said, standing in the doorway of the garage on the 3rd day, "I know who you are. I know what unit you served with. I know about Operation Ember Ridge in 1994. I know your name is still classified in most of the documentation from that mission, but I found enough to know you led it." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, wiping his hands on the same rag he always kept nearby, buying himself time the way he always had in moments that required careful thought. "That's not a story I tell," he said finally. "I understand that," the reporter said, "but I think people need to hear it, not the classified parts, just enough. Because right now, half this city is calling you a hero for defending your garage, and the other half is quietly wondering if maybe you provoked those young men, if maybe an old man really could have done what witnesses are saying you did without something more going on. I think the truth would settle that conversation permanently, and I think it might do something more important than that too." "What's that?" "I think it might remind this city what it actually means when it throws away men like you before it ever bothers to ask who they really are." Marcus considered her for a long time, the same careful, evaluative look he had once given new recruits, assessing not their skill, but their intention. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Come inside," he said. "I'll tell you what I can." The story that ran 3 days later wasn't sensational. It was careful, respectful, and utterly devastating in its quiet power. It told the story of a boy from a broken neighborhood who had walked through the only open door available to him, who had spent 31 years serving a country that had, for most of his childhood, made clear it didn't fully see him as equal, who had led men into the most dangerous places on earth and brought the vast majority of them home, who had retired quietly and asked for nothing except the ability to fix cars in peace. It also told, carefully, without excessive detail, what had happened 3 days earlier in his garage, and it included something the reporter had specifically requested and Marcus had specifically granted: security footage from a camera Marcus kept mounted above his workbench, footage that showed, in exact and unforgiving clarity, the entire encounter from start to finish. The footage went further than the newspaper article ever could. It didn't need commentary. It didn't need analysis. It simply showed 3 young men walking into a garage to rob an old man they assumed was helpless, and it showed, with brutal efficiency, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Within 48 hours of the article's publication, the footage had been viewed over 11 million times. The consequences that followed were not the stuff of fantasy. There was no dramatic courtroom speech, no crowd of supporters carrying Marcus on their shoulders through the streets. What followed was something far more realistic, and in its own way, far more meaningful. The young man who had held the weapon, whose name was eventually revealed as Damon Reyes, 23 years old, was charged with attempted armed robbery. He had 2 prior arrests, both for minor offenses, and this would be his first felony conviction. The man with the duffel bag, identified as Terrell Simmons, 26, was charged as an accomplice, though prosecutors noted his cooperation with investigators afterward, providing information about the source of the cash in the bag, which turned out to be proceeds from an unrelated theft the 2 men had committed earlier that same morning at a convenience store 3 blocks away. The youngest of the 3, the one who had fled, was identified through the footage and turned himself in 4 days later, accompanied by his grandmother, who had recognized him in the viral video and marched him straight to the police station herself. His name was Jamal Ortiz, 19 years old, and unlike his companions, this had been his first criminal act of any kind. He wept during his statement to police, explaining that Damon had promised him $500 simply to act as lookout, that he had never touched a weapon, never intended for anyone to be hurt, and had run the moment things escalated precisely because he realized how badly the situation had spiraled beyond anything he had agreed to. Marcus, when asked by prosecutors whether he wanted to press for maximum sentencing across all 3 young men, gave an answer that surprised nearly everyone who heard it. "Give Damon and Terrell what the law says they've earned," he said. "But that boy who ran, Jamal, I want to meet him before you decide anything." The request was unusual enough that it required special arrangement, but eventually, 3 weeks later, Marcus sat across a table from Jamal Ortiz in a small room at the county courthouse, a public defender and a supervising officer present as witnesses. Jamal couldn't meet his eyes at first, staring instead at his own hands, folded tightly on the table between them. "You know what I did for 31 years, son?" Marcus asked. Jamal shook his head. "I led men into places most people will never have to imagine. I watched good men make one bad decision under pressure and pay for it with everything they had. And I watched other men make that same bad decision and get a second chance to become something better, because somebody in their life decided they were worth the risk of believing in." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to pretend what you did wasn't serious. It was. You walked into my garage as part of a robbery, and that's a fact you're going to have to carry with you. But I've read your file. First offense, no violence in your history before this. A grandmother who drove you straight to a police station the second she recognized you, which tells me more about who raised you than anything you did in my garage that morning." Jamal finally looked up, eyes red. "I'm not asking the court to let you walk away from this without consequences," Marcus continued. "Consequences matter, but I am asking them to give you a path that doesn't end with you becoming exactly what Damon already is, because I think you can still choose differently if somebody gives you the room to." The court, weighing Marcus's statement alongside Jamal's cooperation and clean prior record, ultimately sentenced him to 18 months of probation, mandatory community service, and enrollment in a vocational training program rather than incarceration. Damon Reyes and Terrell Simmons received sentences of 4 and 3 years respectively, reflecting their prior records and the severity of their actions. But the story didn't end with sentencing, because Marcus Webb had never been a man interested in punishment for its own sake. 6 months after the incident, he did something that surprised even the reporter who had first told his story. He reached out to the vocational program supervising Jamal's community service and offered to take him on as an apprentice at the garage. 2 afternoons a week, teaching him the trade that had given Marcus himself a purpose after decades of a very different kind of work. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, Marcus would later explain to anyone who asked how he could stand to work alongside the boy who had once helped rob him. It was something more practical than forgiveness. It was recognition. Recognition that Jamal had been failed long before he ever walked into that garage by a system, a neighborhood, a series of circumstances that had narrowed his options the same way Marcus's own options had once been narrowed decades earlier. The difference was that Marcus had found a door. He wanted to make sure Jamal found one too, before it was too late. 2 years later, the garage on 5th and Larkin looked almost exactly the same as it always had, except now there were 2 names painted on the sign above the door instead of 1. Webb and Ortiz Auto Repair. Jamal had completed his probation without incident, finished his vocational certification, and stayed on, first as an apprentice, then eventually as a full partner, learning not just the mechanics of engines, but the quiet, deliberate discipline that had defined Marcus's entire life. The Shelby Mustang still sat in the corner of the garage, gleaming, untouched by anyone but Marcus's own hands, still not for sale, though now there was a second young man in the shop who understood, without needing to be told, exactly why. Marcus never sought out further attention after the initial story broke. He turned down interview requests, book deals, offers from documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell the full story of his military career, the parts that remained classified, and the parts he simply preferred to keep private. What he did accept, eventually, quietly, was an invitation to speak at a handful of community centers around the city. Not about heroism, not about the incident in his garage, but about the doors that had been available to him as a young man and the doors that had closed for so many others. He spoke about growth without grand speeches, without demanding applause. He spoke the way he had always lived, precisely honestly, without wasted words, and the rooms he spoke in were always quiet, always full, always changed a little by the time he finished. Jamal Ortiz, for his part, would later tell people that the worst morning of his life had somehow become the reason he still had one worth living. He would say it plainly, without embellishment, standing in the garage that had once nearly ended everything for him, now surrounded by the tools of a trade that had given him something to build instead of something to steal. Marcus Webb never asked to be seen as extraordinary. For most of his life, the world had trained him to expect the opposite, to expect to be underestimated, overlooked, mistaken for something small. But in the end, it wasn't the 31 years of service that defined him most, and it wasn't the 4 seconds in his garage that made him a viral headline. It was what he chose to do afterward, when he had every reason to want punishment and chose, instead, to offer a door. Stories like this rarely make the news for long. They are replaced within days by the next headline, the next outrage, the next viral clip competing for attention in a world that moves too fast to sit with anything for very long. But somewhere in that city, a garage still opens every morning at 6:15, and inside it, an old soldier and a young man who once tried to rob him are still working side by side, quietly proving something the world too often forgets to notice. If this story moved you, share it. Stories like Marcus Webb's rarely get the attention they deserve. They're buried under headlines that never bother to ask who someone really is before deciding what they're worth. Somewhere near you, there is probably someone just like him, underestimated, overlooked, carrying a history nobody around them has ever bothered to ask about. Take a moment today to see the people in front of you a little more closely. You never know whose story you're standing in the middle of.